The first thing I remember after waking up is the sound. Not voices, not beeping monitors, just this low rhythmic hiss, a machine pushing air into my lungs, because my body had apparently decided somewhere around 2:47 on a Tuesday morning in March that it no longer wanted to do that on its own. I had a massive cardiac event. That's the clinical language. What it actually felt like, the 11 seconds I was conscious before I collapsed in my kitchen, was someone reaching through my chest with both hands and squeezing everything inside at once. My vision went white, then orange, then nothing. I was 63 years old. I had just poured myself a glass of water. I was wearing socks with the days of the week on them. It was a Tuesday, and I was wearing the Wednesday pair because I'd grabbed them from the wrong drawer. That detail stuck with me later. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the last small, ordinary human thing I did before my life cracked in half. My name is Raymond Calloway. I spent 31 years building a commercial real estate firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am not a man who asks for help easily. I am not a man who cries in front of people or says, "I love you," without meaning it all the way down to the bone. I built something real with my hands and my time and 3 decades of early mornings and missed vacations. I did it for my family. I thought that was understood. I was wrong about a lot of things. My wife, Margaret, passed 6 years before that Tuesday night. Breast cancer, the kind that moves fast and doesn't negotiate. We had 28 years together. Good years, honest years. And when she went, she took a whole version of me with her. I rebuilt slowly, the way you do. I put more of myself into the business. I traveled less. I started cooking more, just to have something to do with my hands in the evenings. I have one son, Derek. He's 36, smart. Went to Duke. Married a woman named Simone, whose family is from the Boston area. Her father, Victor Langston, runs a small pharmaceutical distribution company and has the kind of quiet, permanent confidence that makes you feel like you're being evaluated whenever he shakes your hand. Simone is lovely. I always liked her. That part is important to say, because what happened wasn't about her. Derek and I have always had a relationship that functioned best at a certain distance. We love each other. I believe that completely. But somewhere in his 30s, my son started seeing me less as his father and more as a balance sheet. The shift was gradual. I didn't catch it in time. I woke up in the ICU on a Thursday. My neighbor, a retired school teacher named Carolyn, had heard the crash when I hit the floor and called 911. She'd had a key to my house since Margaret died, because I'd asked her to check on my dog when I traveled. That key saved my life. I sent her flowers every year on the anniversary after that. The nurses told me I had been unconscious for approximately 38 hours. I had a stent placed. There was talk of a second procedure. My cardiologist, a composed woman named Dr. Patricia Hale, explained what had happened to my heart with the kind of careful patience you use when you're not entirely sure the person in front of you fully understands how close they came to not being in front of you anymore. I understood. I asked for my phone. There were 14 missed calls, 3 from Carolyn, 2 from my assistant at the firm, Sandra, 4 from my attorney, Howard, 1 from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years who had apparently seen something on social media, 4 from a number labeled Derek Sell. 4 calls in 38 hours. I called him back. It rang twice. Dad. His voice had that particular texture, not quite relief, not quite guilt, somewhere between the two. They said you were stable. I was going to come down this weekend. I was in the ICU with a tube recently removed from my throat, and my son was going to come down this weekend. Where are you? I asked. A half-second pause, just long enough to notice. We're in Scottsdale. Victor's birthday thing. It's been planned for months, Dad. They told me you were stable. I found out later, not from Derek, but from Sandra, who had spoken to Carolyn, who had apparently tracked down Derek's number through my emergency contacts, that he had been informed within 2 hours of my collapse. He had been at a resort in Arizona. There were photos on Simone's Instagram, a rooftop dinner, string lights, Victor in a linen blazer raising a glass, Derek beside him laughing at something. A reel of 4 people on a golf course the next morning, sun already high. I did not bring this up on the phone. I asked if he was having a good time. He said it was fine. He asked what the doctor said. I told him. He said he'd call again that evening. He called the following afternoon. I was discharged after 9 days. Carolyn picked me up. She brought a casserole and sat with me for 2 hours while I got my bearings, and she talked about her garden and her grandchildren and asked nothing from me except to eat something. I have thought about that afternoon many times since, what it means when someone shows up because they simply want to. Derek came to Charlotte 3 weeks after I got home. He brought Simone. We had dinner. Simone kept touching my arm and asking how I was feeling. Derek talked about a project his firm was working on and a neighborhood in Raleigh he thought had investment potential. We didn't talk about Scottsdale. We didn't talk about the 4 phone calls. I wasn't ready, and maybe I was still telling myself the story that good fathers don't pick fights during recovery, that there was time, that whatever was fraying between us could wait. It waited about 6 weeks. I was back in the office part-time, taking things slowly the way Dr. Hale had instructed, when I got a request from Derek to meet with him and his attorney. His attorney. Not a, "Let's have lunch, Dad," not a phone call. A formal meeting request with an attorney to discuss, and I am reading from the email now because I kept it, estate planning matters and a proposed equity transfer arrangement. I called Howard before I responded to anything. Howard Briggs has been my attorney for 22 years. He is meticulous, slightly humorless, and the most trustworthy person in my professional life. When I read him the email, there was a silence on his end that told me everything. "Don't respond yet," he said. "Let me make some calls." What Howard pieced together over the following days was this. Derek had, at some point in the previous year, apparently had conversations with Victor, with a financial advisor, possibly with others, about the structure of my estate, about the firm, about what would happen to assets if I died. I had a will. Derek knew this. It was straightforward. The firm would go into a managed trust, a portion to Derek, a portion to a foundation Margaret and I had set up years ago for childhood literacy programs in the Charlotte area. The house, some investments, the standard architecture of a life built carefully. What Derek, or whoever had been doing the math around him, had calculated was that my total estate, including the firm's current valuation, landed somewhere close to $4 million, and what he wanted, through the formal meeting with the attorney, was an immediate equity transfer of what the document called a fair portion of illiquid assets, 55% of the firm, valued, by their calculation, at approximately $2.2 million. He wanted it now, while I was alive, while I was still recovering from a cardiac event. He called it estate planning. I called it something else. I agreed to the meeting. Howard advised against it at first. Then I explained what I intended to do, and he thought about it for a moment and said, "Okay, but I'll be there." We met at Howard's office. Neutral ground. That had been their attorney's suggestion. A man named Elliot Marsh, who I'd never met. Youngish, press suit, the polished manner of someone who has learned to make uncomfortable things sound procedural. Derek came alone, not with Simone. I noticed that. He looked good. He always looked good. Margaret's cheekbones, her dark eyes, a composure he'd built deliberately over years of wanting to seem like someone who had his life arranged. He shook my hand when I came in, held it a second. We sat down. Elliot Marsh opened a folder. I let him talk for about 4 minutes before I held up one hand. "Elliot," I said, and I watched him register the name drop, the informality. "I'm going to stop you there." Derek looked at me. "I want to ask your client something first." I turned to Derek, not with anger. That surprised him more than anger would have. "The night I collapsed, you were at the resort, Victor's birthday. You got the call from Sandra around 2 a.m, her time." He didn't answer immediately. "I'm not asking you to defend it," I said. I'm telling you what I know because I think we should be honest with each other in this room." I let that sit for a moment. "You took 40 hours to call me back. You were on a golf course the morning after I almost died." "Dad!" "I'm not finished. I wasn't loud. I want to be clear about that. I was not performing. I've been thinking about this for 6 weeks. Not with anger. I worked through that part, just thinking about who you've become and wondering where I was when that was happening." Derek's jaw tightened. Elliot Marsh had gone very still. "You want $2.2 million, I said. "You brought an attorney to ask me while I'm recovering from a cardiac event 6 weeks after you were photographed on a golf course in Scottsdale while I was in the ICU. And I want you to think very carefully about what you believe that says about what we are to each other." The silence in that room was unlike other silences. It had weight and texture. Derek said quietly, "I was told you were stable. I was in the ICU. "I know. Do you?" He looked at the table. One of his hands, flat on the surface, pressed slightly into the wood. This is where the story turns. Because Derek assumed he was walking into a negotiation, he and Elliot Marsh and whoever had been coaching him thought this was about leverage and legal language and a father who was tired and shaken and might just give them what they wanted to keep the peace. 2 weeks before that meeting, I had already met with Howard and rewritten my will. Not in anger. I want to be precise about this. I have thought carefully about the difference between revenge and consequence, and I believe they live in different parts of a person's character. Revenge wants to hurt. Consequence wants to be honest. Here is what I did. I transferred 23% of the firm into the Margaret Calloway Foundation, structured so that it would generate income for the literacy programs she cared about for decades to come. I donated that afternoon to a cause my wife believed in, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since March. I also updated my will so that Derek would receive what I had always intended, a meaningful inheritance, a fair portion, the expression of a father who loved his son. What he would not receive was control. The firm would be managed by a trust with Sandra, who had worked beside me for 19 years and knew every inch of that company. As the operating trustee for a 5-year period, Derek could receive distributions. He could not liquidate. The $2.2 million transfer he was asking for, the immediate equity grab, was now mathematically impossible. The ownership structure he thought he was negotiating against no longer existed. I told him this in the meeting, not with a dramatic reveal. I slid a copy of the updated documents across the table, and I said, "I want you to know what the estate looks like now, before we go any further." I watched Elliot Marsh read it first, watched his expression shift from professional neutrality to something that looked like a lawyer recalculating his fee. Derek read more slowly. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. Not crying, not yet, but the way they get when someone is holding something back with everything they have. "You already did this," he said, 2 weeks ago. "Because of Scottsdale." I took a long breath. "Because of a lot of things that have been building for a long time. Scottsdale was the moment I finally stopped looking away. What I expected was anger, or a lawyer's objection, or Derek going cold and professional the way he does when he's hurt. What I didn't expect was what actually happened." Elliot Marsh quietly closed his folder, said he'd step out, and left. I've always respected that, knowing when a room needs to be smaller. Derek sat there for a long moment, long enough that Howard glanced at me once, and I gave a small shake of my head. "Not yet. Let him be." I knew how it looked. Derek finally said. His voice was low. "I told Simone we should come home. She said the doctors had said stable, and that if we left early, Victor would—" He stopped himself. "I'm not blaming her. I made the choice." "I know. I told myself you were fine." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment. "It was easier to believe that." "I know that, too." He dropped his hands and looked at me. Really looked, the way adult children sometimes forget to. "The money, I want you to know that wasn't—" He struggled with it. Victor kept saying the estate was at risk because you just had a health event and the firm was unprotected, and if something happened, there were tax implications, and He exhaled. I let him drive it. I let him turn it into a project. That was the moment I understood something I'd missed. Victor Langston, with his polished confidence and his pharmaceutical distribution company and his long-game patience, he had been managing my son the way he managed his business, identifying opportunity, timing the approach. Derek wasn't innocent. He had let it happen. He had been in that golf cart the morning after my collapse, smiling in a photograph. But he was also, in some way I hadn't fully accounted for, a son who had lost his mother and built a life inside another family, trying to belong to both worlds and losing the thread of who he actually was. That doesn't erase things, but it changes the shape of them. I don't want your money, I told him. I never needed you to want my money. I needed you to want me. He broke then, not loudly, just broke. The way grief finally comes out when it's been held in a professional posture for too long. He cried the way I hadn't seen since Margaret's funeral, and I sat across from him and let it happen, because that's what that moment needed. We didn't hug, not then. That would have been too fast, too easy, a shortcut through something that needed to be walked all the way through. But we talked for another 2 hours in that conference room. About Margaret, about the distance that had grown, about what I had needed from him and what he had been too afraid to give because he'd built so much of himself around not needing things. It's been 11 months since that meeting. The firm is doing well. Sandra is a better operational mind than I gave her credit for, and I have stepped back to the role I should have occupied 3 years ago. Vision without exhaustion. Dr. Hale says my cardiac markers are the best she's seen in a year. Carolyn's garden apparently won some kind of neighborhood association award, and she brought me tomatoes in September. Derek and I talk on the phone most Sundays now, real conversations. The kind where you don't have an agenda. He and Simone are expecting their first child, a girl due in February. He called to tell me, and he was crying before he finished the sentence. I have not spoken to Victor Langston since before the meeting. I don't anticipate that changing. Some relationships reveal their architecture only when tested, and what I saw in that architecture told me everything I needed to know. I still think about that Tuesday night sometimes. The glass of water on the counter, the wrong socks, how close everything came to ending without ever being said. I keep those socks in my dresser drawer, not out of sentimentality exactly, more as a small physical reminder that ordinary moments are the ones you don't know you're inside of until they're over. That the things you keep telling yourself you'll get to eventually have a way of running out of eventually. I almost died wearing the wrong day of the week, and somehow, in the long, strange aftermath of that, I ended up with the truest version of my son I've ever known. That's not nothing. That's almost everything. What would you have done if you were in Raymond's position? Would you have restructured the estate or given Derek a chance to explain himself first before making any decisions?